BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Yeah, I know what you must be thinking. But it's true. For many years now, my favourite holiday reading has been the writings of the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. By all means, call me pretentious. Why not? People have been calling me that since I was a teenager. I've learnt to live with it, and so can you. Holidays are by definition a break from routine, and therefore the perfect opportunity to be more ambitious in your choice of reading. Removed from the habits of daily life, you have the leisure to concentrate on those writers you've always promised yourself, if only you had the time. On holiday, you have the time, more than is usually necessary for most escapist literature. There is, after all, nowhere else to escape to. On each occasion, I take a different work by Nietzsche with me, and aim to have read it by my return. Some of his books, I'll admit, are easier to finish than others. Nietzsche has been with me on alpine trails and mountainsides, in forests and meadows, airports and hotel bedrooms, spas, bars and cafes. The truth is, I like his voice. I like the tone of it. Nietzsche is one of those writers who addresses his reader directly. You feel alone with him while he explores his thoughts in your presence. This makes him one of the best travelling companions. Plus, most of his books are fairly slim, so they fit easily into your luggage. But he is far from convenient. Barbed in his observations but reserved in his manner, Nietzsche can be funny and painfully self-revealing. He can come across as wrong-headed, boorish, frustrated, and like all of us, deeply flawed. But you don't just permit yourself to read those writers of whom you approve or with whom you are already in agreement, do you? The first time I ever crossed paths with the writer himself, rather than his work, was in a pretty but otherwise unremarkable cobbled square in the centre of Turin. It was here that, depending on how you look at it, Nietzsche either set the seal on his life's work or drew a veil of madness over it. Either way, it felt like I was coming in at the end of something. Early one morning, Nietzsche had left his lodgings only to witness a cab driver beating his horse in the little piazza where I was now standing. Accounts vary slightly on what happened next. Flinging his arms around the horse's neck to protect it, Nietzsche fell to the ground unconscious. He was carried back to his hotel along a little side street overlooked by the stern red brick walls of the Palazzo Carignano. When he eventually regained consciousness, Nietzsche was no longer sane. Up until his death 11 years later in 1900, he was never in his right mind again, but lapsed instead into an apathetic silence. Some Italian friends had brought me to this spot, through Art Nouveau arcades, covered passages and old archways that marked the original city walls. I could see why Nietzsche had loved Turin so much and expressed such pleasure at his return here. He called it his proved place, his royal residence in Ecce Homo, the last short book he completed before his long mental withdrawal from the world. Ecce Homo is an autobiographical work of gleeful, almost mocking stridency, in which the line between self-parody and self-justification is blurred to the point of erasure. There is, for example, the blasphemous thrill of its title. Ecce Homo, or Behold the Man, are the words spoken by Pontius Pilate when he presents Christ to the mob. Is Nietzsche comparing himself here to what he called the crucified one? What the book offers is Nietzsche's own overview of his major writings up to the point of his return to Turin, where he now declares himself to be on the edge of some great philosophical breakthrough. Chapter titles such as Why I Am So Wise, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am a Destiny may leave you feeling doubtful about sharing a railway carriage with this man, let alone an entire holiday. The book ends precariously balanced between ecstatic certainty and despair. Its last fully formed sentence, a simple question. Have I been understood? I find it hard not to sense a rising panic and uncertainty behind these words, as if their author feared he wasn't on the edge of greatness, but of the deepest obscurity. Not a good place to start, but as I said, in that pretty little square in Turin, it felt more like being present at the end of something. you'd be wiser to begin instead with the book's subtitle, an equally simple but paradoxical phrase that helped me understand one of Nietzsche's major preoccupations. How one becomes what one is represented for Nietzsche the summation of a struggle both personal and philosophical. As I read it, how one becomes what one is refers to the dynamic and stable process of personal development, of self-creation, to which Nietzsche subjected himself throughout his life. The philosopher, in Nietzsche's view, should be in ceaseless conflict with society, acting as a vital cultural corrective in times of laziness and complacency. The philosopher, he argued in an early notebook, is more useful when there is a great deal to destroy. Nietzsche also believed that the first thing philosophers had to offer, even before their writings, was the example of how they lived their own lives. Hence the emphasis upon becoming what you are, a condition riven with doubts, uncertainties and sudden insights, but still preferable to one based upon unchallenged assumptions and academic conventions. Nietzsche could and did lose a lot from adhering to this radical position, something he would acknowledge in Ecce Homo when he declared that his time had not yet come, before adding with dryly optimistic irony that some are born posthumously. What had brought him to such a risky personal commitment? The slow cruise I took through the islands off the Scottish coast one summer supplied an answer. I brought Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations with me. This relatively early work turned out to be a ticking seismograph of a book, registering powerful shifts in thought and attitude beneath its orderly surface, something that fitted the easy rolling schedule of life below deck. Away from land and framed by portholes, the sea and the sky have a monotony tinged with grandeur, while the cupboard door in the cabin, swinging open and closed with the gentle swelling of each wave, creaks like the rigging of an old wooden ship. Lying head to head with me in a separate berth and sharing the reading light is Rachel, my wife and most favoured companion. She loves the undisturbed silence as much as I do, especially when peering at the world through the viewfinder of her cameras. The cabin itself was small but very carefully arranged, laid out like the interior of a spaceship, evoking for me the self-contained tidiness of a constant traveller, such as Nietzsche. Untimely Meditations is not one book, but 4, grouped together under a common title. It struck me as the work of someone slowly but determinedly pulling away from everything he'd hitherto been sure of. The title and subject matter of the individual parts matters less to me than the deepening levels of indifference with which each of them was greeted on initial publication. Like anyone who writes for a living, I harbour a secret sympathy for failure. It is in many ways easier to endure than success. Nietzsche effectively wrote himself out of public view with these books. During what remained of his active writing life, none of his published works was that popular. The lack of readers would lead him to complain in private about what he called the desperate inconvenience of being born as a philosopher among the Germans. Nietzsche was raised the son of a Lutheran minister and had quickly proved to be an academic prodigy destined for a brilliant, if conventional, career. The title page for all 4 Untimely Meditations refers to their author as Dr. Friedrich Nietzsche, Professor of Classical Philology at the University of Basel, a post he'd taken up aged just 24. He was also part of Richard Wagner's intimate circle and had caused a stir by praising the composer as the saviour of German culture in his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy. It was from this exalted position that Nietzsche began his slow downward slide into greatness. I lay across my bunk, feet up on a chair back, Nietzsche's book propped open on my chest. Can a philosopher born posthumously be necessary to his times? Probably not, I decided, but he can understand them better than most. Untimely Meditations sets out a diagnosis that nobody wanted to hear, least of all the people it was aimed at. As our ship sliced through the North Sea, the days blurring into each other, Nietzsche's contempt for the self-satisfaction he saw around him became increasingly clear to me. He wrote dismissively of what he called the educated Philistines, that vast proportion of the populace who had learned what culture was in school and had no time for anything new or difficult, thank you very much. He railed against an unquestioned worship of the past. For Nietzsche, this had resulted in an unremarkable age whose stale decorative clichés concealed a fretful, nervous emptiness. There was, he wrote, evidence only of weariness, of a desire for diversion at any price, of a tattered memory and incoherent personal experience. His words made me sit up. Here was an accurate description of today's digital regime, especially when Nietzsche describes the condition in terms of automata repeatedly moving their limbs out of blind habit. Are there still human beings, he asks, of such behaviour? Or perhaps only thinking, talking and writing machines? When such actions constitute our entire being, Nietzsche argues, the result is a dangerous complacency. It was getting late. Rachel switched off the cabin lights, and together we watched the phantom wake of the ship, a spectral pale churning against the blackness of the sea. To be at odds with your age requires little talent and hardly any effort. These days it's enough simply to log on to Twitter. To turn that dissatisfaction into a form of self-knowledge, to see in one's own dryness and narrowness the desire for something greater, demands a lot more. Untimely Meditations is the first registering of Nietzsche becoming what he is, or at least acknowledging the urge to do so. We have been taught by Greek art, he wrote in a notebook from the period, that there is no truly beautiful surface without a terrible depth. As the classical philologist gave way to the philosopher in him, Nietzsche started to explore the inner turbulence and instability that lurk beneath thought and language. He compared these outer forms, however fixed and certain they might appear, to the shapes thrown up by a choppy sea while a storm rages in its depths. Perhaps such primal forces could be embraced, or possibly emulated. Everything that can influence a philosopher's life is now open to interrogation as you struggle to free yourself from your past, your education, your country, even the influence of those you formerly admired. A pale, northern sun was still smouldering outside the porthole. I'd reached my limit. Rachel observed that we subconsciously prepare ourselves for ending something by slowly growing tired and irritated with it. We went up on deck to watch the sunset dying on the horizon. The ship was moving so slowly that the waves seemed to be flowing like oil around it, trailing long furrows along the side. The light and water and land merging into abstract plays of line and colour. Nothing was fixed, I realised. This landscape was only temporary, the result of massive planetary forces exerted upon the shaping of this sky, this sea, the formation of these rocks. What had seemed permanent and real was still in the process of becoming what it is. And a small voice whispered in my ear on that quiet midsummer night, "Have I been understood?"